It was meant to be a night of warmth, a table filled with laughter, a meal shared between family, a Christmas gathering like any other. But by the time the night was over, 3 people would be dead. A mother, a daughter, and a sister, taken in a way no one saw coming. At the centre of it all, a woman who never confessed, a cake homemade with care, a slice passed around the table. And hidden within it, a poison so deadly, it left an entire family shattered. Her name was Daisy Moura dos Anjos. She never spoke a word of guilt, she never admitted to anything. But the evidence told a different story. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't misfortune, this was arsenic. A substance with no taste, no smell. It didn't strike immediately. It let the victims enjoy their final moments before slowly shutting down their bodies. By the time the first signs of poisoning appeared, it was already too late. A child watched his mother collapse. A husband held onto his wife as she gasped for air. The holiday joy turned into chaos. Sirens, paramedics, confusion. But nothing could stop what had already been set in motion. 3 people gone. A family broken. And one woman who refused to answer the one question everyone was asking. Why? Can we say this is a case of murder? Or a story of betrayal? A story of trust shattered by the hands of someone meant to protect? Daisy never admitted to the crime, but the poison was in her hands, the search history on her phone, the traces of arsenic in places that only she had access to. The signs were there long before that Christmas night. But no one knew just how dangerous she had become. This is the story of how one woman walked into a holiday celebration and left behind a crime so devastating, it would haunt those who survived it forever. Hi, I'm Fletcher J. The best thing you can do for me is to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I'd love for you to stick around for what's next, because this case, it only gets darker from here. Christmas had always been a tradition for the Dos Anjos family. The table set with care, the lights flickering softly, plates filled with food made from old family recipes. Year after year, they gathered like this. Smiles, laughter, toasts to another year together. But the warmth in that home was an illusion. The cracks in their relationships had been there for years, just beneath the surface. Small arguments that had never been resolved. Resentments that had been pushed aside, never truly forgotten. It was a family that looked close from the outside. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. And for Daisy Moura dos Anjos, that tension was something she carried every single day. She had been a part of the family for decades, married in, expected to blend in. But the truth was she had never really belonged. Her mother-in-law Zili was the matriarch, strong, opinionated. She ran the household with authority, and over the years Daisy had grown to resent her. Her sister-in-law Maida was always in the spotlight, the one who did things the right way, the one who never seemed to struggle. Daisy had always felt compared to her, always felt like she came up short. And then there was Tatiana, younger, full of life, everything Daisy used to be, before the weight of her own reality had settled in. They were family, but they were never truly hers, and every holiday, every gathering, was just another reminder of that. Daisy had spent years trying to fit in, years trying to ignore the feeling of being an outsider, the quiet dismissals, the small jabs in conversation, the way she always seemed like an afterthought. She had swallowed it all, but silence doesn't erase resentment, it lets it grow. And in Daisy's case, it had grown into something that couldn't be ignored anymore. Her marriage had been strained for years. The love she once had with her husband had faded into routine. There was no passion, no excitement, just 2 people occupying the same space, bound by time more than by love. She had no real voice in the family, no power, no control, but there was one thing she could control. The meal. The Christmas dinner, where for one night she could be at the centre, where the food she prepared, the cake she baked, would be eaten by everyone, where, for the first time in years, they would all feel the weight of her presence. The decision wasn't made in a moment. It wasn't anger that pushed her to do it. It wasn't a single fight, a single betrayal. It was years of standing in the background, years of being ignored. She had baked that cake with her own hands, measured each ingredient carefully, mixed the flour, the sugar, the eggs, poured the batter into the pan. But there was one ingredient no one could taste, a colourless, odourless poison, arsenic. She knew what it would do. She knew how long it would take before they started feeling it. And as she slid that cake into the oven, she knew that by the time the night was over, nothing would ever be the same again. A meal that was supposed to bring the family together would become their last. And Daisy Moura dos Anjos? She was about to make sure that for the first time they would never forget her. The cake sat at the centre of the table, its golden crust still warm, the scent of vanilla and cinnamon filling the room. It looked perfect, just like any other Christmas dessert. No one questioned it. Plates were passed, slices cut, forks sinking into soft layers. A moment of silence as the first bites were taken. Then laughter resumed, conversation flowed, compliments were given. The cake was good. Daisy watched as her family ate, her expression unreadable. Every person at that table, her mother-in-law, her sister-in-law, her niece, had no reason to suspect anything. They had no idea that with each bite, something invisible was slipping into their bloodstream, something that would soon begin to work its way through their bodies, turning a moment of celebration into something far worse. Arsenic doesn't act immediately, it waits. The first signs were subtle, a headache, a feeling of discomfort, but soon the symptoms became undeniable. Zeli, the matriarch of the family, felt the first wave hit her, dizziness, a sudden overwhelming nausea. She excused herself from the table, brushing it off as exhaustion from the holiday rush. Maida, her sister, tried to stand but stumbled, gripping the edge of the table as a wave of pain shot through her stomach. Tatiana, the youngest among them, let out a sharp gasp, clutching her chest. Her son, just 10 years old, looked up at her in confusion, his small hands gripping hers. Something was wrong, very wrong. The laughter stopped. The warmth in the room turned to confusion, then to fear. What had been a festive meal was now spiraling into chaos. Zeli collapsed onto the floor. The others followed one by one, voices overlapped in panic, calls for help, the scraping of chairs as family members rushed to their sides. Someone grabbed a phone, fingers shaking as they dialed emergency services. Every second felt longer than the last. The poison was doing exactly what it was meant to do. It attacked the stomach first, causing violent vomiting. Then it worked its way through the nervous system, dizziness, convulsions, and unbearable burning in the throat. And then the worst of it, the body began shutting down. Tatiana was the first to stop moving. Then Maida. Zeli, barely conscious, could hear the sounds around her fading, could feel the weight of something irreversible sinking in. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but by then it was too late. Tatiana was gone. Maida was gone. And Nusa, the eldest among them, had taken her last breath. 3 lives. Gone. And at the centre of it all, the woman who had prepared the meal, Daisy Moura dos Anjos. She stood among the wreckage, her expression unreadable, watching as the scene unfolded in front of her. The sirens, the flashing lights, the bodies being lifted onto stretchers, covered in white sheets. She never cried, she never screamed. She simply watched. And in that moment, whether she planned for this or not, whether she had imagined what it would look like when the poison finally took hold, one thing became clear. Her world was about to crumble. The paramedics did everything they could, but for 3 members of the Dos Anjos family, there was nothing left to save. The bodies were taken to the medical examiner's office. Autopsies were performed, and the results left no doubt. Arsenic poisoning. Traces of the toxin were found in their systems, enough to kill, enough to ensure there was no chance of survival. The forensic team worked quickly. Samples were taken from everything on the dinner table. The drinks, the side dishes, the main course. But the real answer was in the cake. Lab tests confirmed what had already been suspected. The flour used to bake it contained dangerous levels of arsenic, a controlled substance, not something that could have been there by mistake. This wasn't food poisoning. It wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose, and that's when investigators started looking closer at the one person who had handled that cake from start to finish. Daisy Moura dos Anjos. Detectives went straight to Daisy. They asked her about the cake, about the ingredients she used, about where the flour had come from. She had answers for everything. She said she bought the flour weeks earlier. She had no idea how it could have been contaminated. She was just as shocked as everyone else. But there was something in her demeanour. She wasn't grieving like the others. She wasn't overcome with emotion. She wasn't asking why this happened. She was only saying what she didn't do. And when investigators dug deeper, her explanations started to fall apart. They searched her home, her kitchen, the place where the cake had been prepared. They checked the packaging of her ingredients. They took every container, every bag, every possible source of contamination. But the flour in Daisy's kitchen was clean. The arsenic had been added after the fact. Someone had deliberately tampered with it. And with that discovery, the investigation took a different turn. They seized her phone, standard procedure, a routine check, and what they found changed everything. Search histories don't lie. There in black and white were the digital footprints of something chilling. She had looked up arsenic, not just once, multiple times. She had researched its effects, its symptoms, how much was needed to kill a person. She had searched for ways to obtain it. And the most damning of all, she had looked up methods to hide it in food. This wasn't an impulse. This wasn't something that happened out of nowhere. This had been planned, carefully, quietly. And for the authorities, there was no doubt about who had orchestrated the deaths of 3 people that night. They brought her in for questioning. She sat across from detectives, hands folded, her face unreadable. They laid out everything in front of her. The forensic reports, the toxicology results, the search history, the undeniable connection between her and the poison. And still, she didn't admit to anything. She didn't break down, she didn't argue, she simply listened. And when they asked her directly if she had poisoned the cake, she only said one thing: "I would never hurt my family." It was the only statement she ever gave. But the evidence spoke louder than words. Detectives had everything they needed, and Daisy Moura dos Anjos was taken into custody. The truth was out. The case against her was strong, but one question remained unanswered. Why? The fallout from Daisy's actions was devastating. Zili, the only survivor, had to come to terms with the loss of her own children and grandchildren. A family that had once been close, now torn apart by one woman's decision. A family's trust broken. Her silence only deepened the wounds. The family struggled to understand how someone they had loved and trusted could do this to them, not just for the survivors, but for those who were left behind. The hospital was silent, too silent for a place that had just witnessed so much life slip away. Zeli dos Anjos sat in a chair outside the ICU, her body motionless, her eyes unfocused. She had lost track of time. Hours, a day, maybe more. The only thing she could feel was the emptiness in her chest, the hollowness where her family used to be. Her sister, her daughter, gone. Tatiana's young son Matthias had survived, but he wasn't speaking. He had watched his mother die, and no child should ever have to see that. Zeli wanted to comfort him, to tell him that everything would be okay, but how could she? Nothing was okay, and it never would be again. The news spread quickly. Relatives arrived, their faces pale with shock, their hands shaking as they reached for one another. Some cried. Others just stood there, stunned into silence. How had this happened? Why had this happened? The home that had once been filled with warmth and celebration was now a place of mourning. Christmas decorations still hung in the living room. Gifts remained untouched under the tree. A cruel reminder of a holiday that had ended in tragedy. And then came the hardest part, accepting that this wasn't fate, this wasn't some unexplainable tragedy. This had been done to them, by someone they had trusted, by someone who had sat at their table, shared their meals, laughed with them, only to take it all away. Daisy hadn't just taken lives, she had destroyed something deeper, the trust that binds a family together. And her silence, that was the deepest cut of all. She didn't explain, she didn't confess, she didn't give them the one thing they needed to make sense of it all. Why? Instead, she sat behind bars, refusing to speak. And with every moment that passed, the pain in her family's hearts deepened. Because when someone you love is taken from you, there's supposed to be a reason. A car accident, a disease, something that allows you to grieve, to find closure. But how do you grieve when the cause is intentional? How do you mourn when the person responsible was one of your own? Zeli was the only one left to pick up the pieces. She had to bury her sister. She had to bury her daughter. And somehow, she had to find a way to raise her grandson, knowing he would grow up without a mother, knowing that the woman who took everything from them had been someone they once called family. The Dos Anjos family would never be whole again, because some wounds don't heal, some losses are permanent, and sometimes the person you fear the most is the one you never saw coming. The cell was quiet. Cold concrete walls, a narrow bed, a small barred window that let in just enough light to remind her that the world outside was still moving. But for Daisy Moura dos Anjos, time had already stopped. Days passed in the same routine, waking up to the sound of guards pacing outside, eating meals in silence, sitting alone staring at the walls. No visitors, no calls. She wasn't awaiting trial, she was waiting for the inevitable. The reality of what lay ahead. A life behind bars, a future where the walls never changed, where the weight of her actions would be the only thing keeping her company. Then, one morning, a guard made the usual rounds, checked the cells, counted the inmates, and when they reached Daisa's door, they found her, lifeless. A bedsheet twisted tightly around her neck, a body motionless against the cold jail floor. No struggle, no fight, just silence. Daisy was gone, the same woman who had refused to confess, the same woman who had never admitted what she had done. Now she would never have to answer for anything. Her story had ended in the same silence she had carried throughout the investigation. No final words, no explanation. Just the echoes of a crime that could never be undone. For the family left behind, her death didn't bring closure. It didn't bring justice. It didn't erase what had been lost. Zeli, still grieving, was left with nothing but more questions. Tatiana's son, still waking up to nightmares, had no one left to hold accountable. Daisy had taken her own way out, leaving the wreckage behind. Some believe it was guilt, that the weight of what she had done had finally caught up to her. Others believe it was something else entirely, that she had never planned to face a lifetime in prison, that, just like everything else, she had taken control of the situation in her own way. Whatever the reason, one truth remained. She would never serve time. She would never answer for what had happened. Her trial would never take place. And for the family that had lost so much, justice would never feel complete. Daisy Moura dos Anjos is gone. But the story she left behind, that will never fade. The pain she caused, the lives she shattered, the questions she left unanswered. A woman who walked into a holiday dinner, knowing what she had planned, and a family that never saw it coming. The funeral was small. Those who gathered didn't come just to mourn. They came with unanswered questions, with pain that hadn't settled. 3 caskets, a mother, a daughter, a sister, taken in a way no one could have predicted. The house that had once been filled with holiday warmth now stood empty. The decorations had been taken down. The gifts never opened. The tragedy that unfolded that Christmas didn't just take lives. It took everything that had once made this family whole. No matter how much time passes, the impact of that night will never fade. Because this wasn't something that could be repaired. A family that had spent years together, bound by blood, was now forever divided by a single act. The kind of betrayal that cannot be forgiven. There will never be a true explanation for what Daisy did. She took that answer with her. Whether it was resentment, years of silent anger, or something deeper inside her that no one ever saw, no one will ever truly know. People who knew her still asked themselves the same thing. Was she always capable of this? Had she been carrying this darkness for years? Or did something inside her finally break? What makes a woman who once stood beside her family decide to destroy it from within? There are crimes that shock communities, crimes that feel so unreal. They become cautionary tales. This was one of them. A story that will be passed down in hushed voices, always ending with the same disbelief, because people want to believe they can trust the ones they share their table with. That when they sit down for a meal with family, they won't have to wonder if it will be their last. But trust is fragile. And when it's broken, when it's shattered in a way that can never be undone, it leaves behind something far worse than grief. It leaves a void, a silence that will never be filled. And for those left behind, the only thing more painful than losing the people they love is knowing who took them away. What do you think led Dicey to do what she did? Was this a woman consumed by resentment, or was there something buried even deeper? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you made it this far, I appreciate you. Be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this. Thanks for being here. Stay safe and cherish the ones you love, because sometimes you never know who they really are.